December 1880. Deadwood, Dakota Territory. The wind came sharp off the Black Hills, carrying wood smoke and the sour tang of unwashed bodies. The rope bit into Caleb Hart's wrists, each gust tightening the burn. Boots scraped the scaffold boards. Somewhere in the crowd a man laughed, too loud, too eager. Caleb kept scanning. Not for an escape, those chances had gone, but for one pair of dark, steady eyes. If Aya was here, she'd be watching without moving, her chin high against the jeers. He wanted to see her once more, to let her know something she could carry. A guard tested the trapdoor with his heel. The boards groaned. Caleb shifted his weight, feeling the knot graze the back of his neck like a cold thumb. He counted the heartbeats between breaths. The memory came unbidden. Rev. Elias Whitcomb on a frost-crusted ridge at sunrise, voice low as the wind. To do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Back then, it had sounded like a map. Now, it was the only direction left. He set his jaw. If he found her in that sea of faces, he'd give her something that looked like peace. If he didn't, he'd hold it anyway. Either way, the day would end on his terms.
6 months earlier, in June, he had ridden into Deadwood with a battered Colt .45, a tired roan, and a soul worn thin from 15 years chasing other men's endings. The town was a fever, canvas giving way to rough timber, mud swallowing wagon wheels, fortunes swelling and breaking in a single week. He tied off outside the Silver Dollar Saloon. The sign promised coffee. The window spilled light and noise. Inside, heat and stink wrapped him, whiskey seeping from a cracked barrel, wet wool steaming, soft coal burning low. Silas Corbin, all rat-bright eyes and narrow shoulders, kept count of the room from behind the bar. The piano stumbled 3 notes behind itself. Cards slapped, coins clinked, tempers rose and fell. She moved through it like a clear stream finding its way through stones. The miners called her Raven because they liked names that turned women into mascots. The braid down her back said Cherokee to anyone who cared to notice. The way she counted change and stacked glasses said mission school and a sharp mind. When a drunk's hand reached for her waist, she shifted just enough to make him miss, then walked on without a word. Caleb ordered coffee.
She set it down without looking at him, but he caught the clipped music of her speech, the edge of fatigue under it. She settled a dispute over a poker pot with quicker math than the players could follow, then absorbed an insult like it was rain on stone. Bo Henley blew in on a gust of cold air and whiskey breath, shoulders broad enough to part the crowd. His eyes found her instantly. He caught her arm as she passed, grinning to show the work he'd had done on his teeth. "Come upstairs, Raven, let's talk." She twisted, but his grip held. Caleb rose without thinking. No draw, no threat, just stepped close and put his hand on Henley's wrist. The smile faltered. Caleb's voice stayed calm. "Let go." Henley yanked back like a man testing a rope. Caleb's other hand settled on the Colt's worn grip. The room stilled. Even the piano fell silent. Henley sneered. "You don't want this fight, stranger." Caleb's eyes didn't move from his. "Maybe not, but you don't want the ending." For a moment, neither did anything. Then Henley released her with a shove and stalked toward the bar, muttering. Aya stood still, breathing steady, her eyes on Caleb now. They held a question and something else he couldn't yet name. He didn't know it then, but in that brief look, the rest of his life had already shifted. Caleb came back the next evening, not because he enjoyed the company, and not because the Silver Dollar served good coffee, it didn't, but because something in Aya's eyes had stayed with him. He took the same corner table, ordered the same thing, nursed it slow, watched her work. Over the next weeks, small details gathered like dust on a windowsill. Her English carried the precision of a schoolroom, layered over the music of another tongue.
She did figures in her head faster than the men dealing cards could shuffle. She remembered orders without writing them down and settled disputes with a word or a look. She spoke little to him, but she didn't hurry away when she brought his cup. Once, when the room was loud enough to cover it, she told him her father had chased gold west and died broke the previous winter. Corbin had covered the burial, at a price. The debt, she said flatly, had doubled in 6 months. One night, a stack of coins spilled near her, clattering to the floor.
She crouched to collect them, and Caleb saw the fine seam where her work apron had been mended twice. Corbin's eyes tracked her like a man weighing the value of his own property. Caleb looked away before the thought in his head turned into action. He learned, too, who might stand with him if things came to it. Widow May Cartwright ran a boarding house 2 streets over. She had a way of putting a cup of tea in your hand and getting the truth out of you before you knew you were speaking. Caleb heard her call Aya Dear Heart once and saw Aya's shoulders ease a fraction. Deputy Sam Collins kept to himself, but his gaze was steady and his handshake firm. Rumor said he'd served in the cavalry during the Indian Wars. He didn't drink, and he didn't laugh at the cruder jokes in the saloon. More than once, Caleb caught him watching Corbin the way a man watches a campfire in dry grass. One wet Tuesday, Caleb lingered until the silver dollar emptied, then asked, "How much now?" Aya's hands stilled over a rag. 200. It grows every month. You think he'll ever let you pay it off? She shook her head once. Even if he did, where would I go?
This is all I know. Caleb left without answering. In his room at May's, he lay awake listening to the rain rattle the windows. Somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd hour, the decision settled in him. He would see her free, and not by buying her like stock from a ledger. 2 days later, news came on the wire. A bank in Miles City, Montana, had been robbed. 12,000 in gold gone. 2,000 in reward for the men responsible, dead or alive. Caleb read the names twice. Rafe Torrin at the top. He knew Torrin, knew the kind of trail he left and the kind of end he deserved. If Caleb found him, that bounty would be enough to clear Aya's debt and set her on a road of her own choosing. Enough for her to decide what came next. The plan was simple. Plans like that always were, until they weren't. A storm boiled over the Black Hills one night, rattling the windows and shaking the walls. Aya worked through it, moving from table to table, the lamplight gilding the curve of her braid. Caleb was about to leave when the saloon door blew open on a gust of rain. 4 men came in, boots heavy, coats dripping, eyes sharp. Torrin last, hat pushed back, smile thin. They went straight to the bar, ordered whiskey, took the corner table as if it were theirs. Upstairs rooms were arranged without money-changing hands. The air in the silver dollar shifted, subtle but sure. Caleb felt it in his bones the way a man feels the drop in pressure before a hard freeze. Aya's glance flicked toward him, quick and unreadable. Outside, the thunder rolled again, long and low, like something counting down. Caleb set his cup down, the porcelain clicking once against the table. Whatever was coming, it had just arrived. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The silver dollar had changed in small, dangerous ways since Torrin's men took up residence. Laughter was louder, cruder. Dice games ran later into the night. The air smelled sharper, cheap tobacco, damp wool, and the faint tang of gun oil. Caleb noticed the way Corbin's eyes tracked the new spenders, quick to refill their glasses, slow to answer when Aya called for help. They tested boundaries first with words, jokes too close to insults, questions that weren't questions at all. Then came the hands on her arm, the blocking of her path. Caleb kept to his corner, watching, learning the pattern.
Torrin himself rarely spoke. He'd sit with his whiskey, pale eyes scanning the room as if he were measuring it for something. Deadwood's streets offered little relief. Miners staggered between saloons, horses shied from the racket, and the air carried the ring of blacksmith hammers long after dark. Caleb found pockets of quiet where he could. The Hollister's workshop was one. Old Jacob and his son Luke had been teaching him to set fence tools right, sharpening spades, oiling hinges. On Sundays, the family gathered on their porch to sing hymns. Aya had joined them twice, her voice low but sure, her hands folded in her lap. Farther up the ridge lived Red Hawk and Nama, Lakota elders who traded herbs for winter against sacks of flour and coffee. They had noticed Aya's careful courtesy, never rushing them, always returning their greetings in their own tongue. One afternoon, Nama pressed a small bundle of dried sage into Aya's hands. "For the cold," she said, in English smoothed by years of use. Aya bowed her head in thanks. Dr. Abigail Turner ran her practice out of a converted boarding room near the assay office.
She was brisk, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and her voice could cut through a barroom argument. When miners came in with crushed fingers or broken ribs, she worked without pause, then nodded respectfully if Aya appeared with a clean cloth or a pot of broth. There was an unspoken recognition between them, a shared understanding of work done in rooms too small and too hard. Still, the clock was ticking. Judge Morrison's circuit court wouldn't ride through for another 3 or 4 days. Until then, whatever Torrin did here would be Deadwood's problem alone, and Sheriff Bradley's reach went only as far as his deputy's boots. That night, the saloon was nearly full. Caleb watched Torrin lean back in his chair, the lamplight catching the thin scar along his jaw. Aya moved between tables, balancing a tray heavy with mugs. She passed Torrin's table without looking at him. His gaze followed her anyway, measuring. Not the way a man measures beauty, the way a man measures leverage. Caleb's coffee had gone cold, but he kept his seat. In the shifting lamplight, the air between Torrin and Aya felt like a drawn wire, thin, silent, waiting to snap. He had seen that look before, in border towns and mining camps, wherever law was a matter of who could pay for it. It never ended in peace. It happened so quickly that most men in the silver dollar swore they only heard the first shot. Bo Henley had been nursing whiskey and bad intentions all evening. By the time Aya stepped near the stairwell to take an order upstairs, he was on his feet. Caleb saw the shift in his shoulders, the way his jaw set. He knew a cornering move when he saw one. Bo pleated himself between Aya and the stairs, one meaty hand braced on the wall beside her head. His other reached for her shoulder, tugging the fabric of her dress. She froze, tray held tight against her ribs. "Let her go." Caleb's voice was even, almost conversational. His chair scraped across the floor as he stood. Bo didn't turn. "Just being friendly." "That's not what she calls it." Caleb stepped closer, Colt loose in his hand. "Last time I asked. This time I'm tellin'." The room went still. Cards hung in the air mid-shuffle. Dice lay where they'd rolled. Aya's eyes flicked from Bo to Caleb. Somewhere at the back of the saloon, Corbin muttered under his breath, calculating the loss of a paying customer. Bo's shoulders rolled as he glanced toward Torrin's table. Torrin didn't move, just gave the smallest tilt of his chin. Permission. The outlaw's hand dropped toward his revolver. Caleb's Colt came up in the same breath. The shot landed center mass. Bo's chest bucked, his back hit the wall, and the tray clattered to the floor. 2 other men went for their guns. Caleb dove sideways, the bar exploding into splinters where he'd stood. He rolled, fired twice. One man staggered back, clutching his gut. The other dropped his weapon and ran for the door. In 30 seconds, it was over. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy, lamps flickering in the draft from the open door.
Aya was gone, slipped away in the confusion. Torrin was gone too. Corbin shouted something about damages, but his voice cracked when Caleb turned toward him. Sheriff Bradley arrived 10 minutes later, Deputy Collins on his heels. The lawman's eyes swept the scene. One dead, one bleeding, tables overturned. His jaw tightened.
"Caleb Harper," he said, using the full name like a verdict. "You're under arrest for murder." "It was self-defense," Caleb answered, blood hot in his ears. "Everyone here saw him draw first." "Maybe so," Bradley said, "but Rafe Torrin filed a formal complaint with Judge Morrison this afternoon. Says you've been threatening his men, looking to collect bounty by provoking them into fights." Caleb felt the trap close like a sprung snare. Pre-filed, planned. Bradley gestured to Collins. "Disarm him. Put him in holding." Collins' gaze lingered a second longer than needed, something unspoken in it. Regret, maybe warning. But his hands were steady as he took Caleb's Colt. As they let him out into the cold street, Caleb caught sight of Torrin watching from the shadowed mouth of an alley, hands in his coat pockets. A slow smile spread across the man's face, thin as a knife. The kind of smile that said the game had only just begun. The holding cell in Deadwood's clapboard courthouse smelled of damp stone and old tobacco. Daylight came in thin, smoky stripes through a barred window, enough to mark the slow crawl of hours.
Sheriff Bradley kept Caleb there while Judge Morrison's circuit court inched toward a hearing date. 10 days. That's how long it took for statements to be gathered, stories to twist, and bias to harden. Bradley came by once a day, face unreadable. Collins brought meals, sometimes lingering with awkward conversation about the weather, the mines, the price of hay, anything but the case. Aya came only once in daylight. She stood behind the iron bars, eyes sharp despite the shadows under them. "You shouldn't have done it," she murmured. "Yes, I should," Caleb answered, voice low. "That's the whole problem." Her gaze flicked to Collins, then back. "I may have a way to end this, but you'll have to trust me." Caleb wanted to press her, but she'd already stepped back. "Just be ready," she said, and was gone. That night, Aya walked into the Silver Dollar, as if nothing had changed. She poured whiskey, cleared tables, and made no effort to avoid Rafe Torrin's orbit. He was suspicious at first, but suspicion was a fragile thing in the presence of flattery and liquor. By the third night, she had him drinking enough to brag. She didn't push, just listened. Names of banks, towns, dates. The grin in his voice when he spoke of a Miles City job gone perfect, except for the mess in the teller's room. He even waved a folded paper, some kind of promissory note, joking about paying off the right folks. Aya kept her smile polite and her eyes lowered, but every detail lodged in her mind. 2 days later, she copied those details in her mission school hand onto a clean sheet of paper, alongside the exact wording of that promissory note. She slipped the note itself into the folds of her skirt when Torrin dropped it after another drink. A debt marker, written in Torrin's own hand, payable to a name Caleb recognized as a fence for stolen gold. Widow May Cartwright, the boarding house owner, agreed to keep the papers hidden. "You're playing with wolves, girl," May warned. "One bite and it's over." "I know," Aya said simply. The hearing came on the 12th day. Torrin arrived in clean clothes, hair slicked, his men lined up behind him like church deacons. He took the stand and, with the solemn tone of a man correcting a grievous wrong, recanted his earlier claims. "I was mistaken," he told Judge Morrison, eyes wide in mock humility. "Bo drew first."
Mr. Harper here was defending the young lady. I'd be wrong not to say so. The prosecutor frowned, shuffled papers. With the key witness reversing himself, the case crumbled. Morrison's mouth tightened like he'd bitten into something sour.
"Charges dismissed," he said at last, "though I warn you, Mr. Harper, Deadwood is not a place for your kind of trouble." Outside, Caleb stepped into the thin winter sunlight, free but hollow. Aya was waiting by the steps, hands folded in front of her. Her eyes held something he couldn't name. Triumph, maybe, but with a cost. "What did you give him?" Caleb asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, "What do you think?" The wind cut between them. The crowd moved on. And whatever victory had been won tasted of ashes in his mouth. 3 mornings after the hearing, Caleb knocked on Rev Whitcomb's door with a simple request. No questions, just vows. The old preacher had seen enough frontier storms, both weather and human, to know when not to pry. At dawn, they climbed a low ridge west of Deadwood. Frost still clung to the grass, and the peaks in the distance caught the first fire of the sun. Widow May came with a shawl over her shoulders.
Deputy Collins stood at Caleb's side, still not sure if this was a blessing or a mistake. Dr. Abigail Turner arrived last, a sprig of winterberry tucked into her hatband. Aya wore a deep blue dress she'd sewn herself from a bolt of fabric May had kept in storage. She carried no bouquet, only a sprig of sage Red Hawk had pressed into her palm for strength in the storms ahead. Whitcomb cleared his throat, voice carrying in the cold air. "Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things." He looked from Caleb to Aya. And out here, that's no poetry, it's survival. Caleb repeated the vows in a voice steady but low, his hand warm against hers. When Whitcomb pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss was brief, careful, 2 people aware that they were making a promise larger than themselves. After the ceremony, they walked straight to the silver dollar. Corbin was counting coins when Caleb laid a leather pouch on the bar. "That's every cent you claim she owes," Caleb said, "plus a receipt, signed by you, saying the debt's settled forever." Corbin's lips thinned, but the jingle of gold won the argument. He scrawled his name on the paper and shoved it across. "Pleasure doing business," he lied. From there, they rode out to the staked claim Caleb had filed weeks before. The Hollisters had left a wagon load of hand tools and fence posts as a wedding gift. The land was raw, thin pines, scrub grass, a creek running fast with snowmelt, but it was theirs. They pitched a canvas tent for sleeping, then spent the afternoon setting the first fence line. By dusk, their shoulders ached and their hands were blistered, but Aya was smiling into her tin cup of coffee. "This," she said, nodding at the half-built corral, "is the first thing I've ever owned that no one could take away." Caleb didn't answer, but the set of his jaw said he'd bleed before letting that change. Nights were quiet now. No saloon noise, no boots on the boardwalk outside. They cooked over a fire, sometimes in silence, sometimes with Caleb telling stories of places he'd seen and people he'd hunted. Aya listened, eyes half closed, asking just enough questions to keep him talking. Every few days, neighbors passed by. Hollisters with extra nails, Red Hawk and Nama with jars of preserved berries, Abigail with a loaf of bread and news from town. All came with the same look, a mixture of hope and the unspoken knowledge that peace on the frontier rarely lasted. One evening, as the sky went lavender over the peaks, Caleb sat on the half-finished porch, watching Aya mend a shirt by the firelight. He thought of the preacher's words, bears, believes, hopes, endures, and wondered how many winters that would have to hold. By the time the first frost of autumn touched the grass, the tent was gone, replaced by a cabin with squared log walls and a stone chimney that drew smoke cleanly into the sky. Caleb had learned more about joinery from the Hollisters in 3 months than he had in all his years fixing other men's barns. Aya turned the single-room cabin into something more. Herbs hanging to dry over the hearth, shelves lined with jars from Nama's preserving lessons, a quilt from Widow Matthey folded neatly at the foot of their bed.
The place smelled of wood smoke, bread, and earth. In spring, they cleared more ground by the creek, building a garden from the Lakota elders' seed lore. Every plant is a story, Red Hawk told Aya, handing her a small pouch of seeds.
If you respect the story, the plant will feed you. By midsummer, squash blossoms sprawled across the rows, corn stood in green spears, and beans climbed the rough poles Caleb had set. It was during one of those planting days that Aya made her quiet decision. 3 days a week, the cabin would serve as a school for the neighbor children. At first, it was just the Hollister boys and little Annie Mae Cartwright. But word traveled along wagon tracks and creek beds, and soon children from as far as Red Rock Ridge came. They sat on benches Caleb built, learning sums on slate boards, practicing letters, and, on Aya's insistence, listening to stories from both the Bible and the old Cherokee tales. One morning, she read aloud in a clear, steady voice. "Let us not grow weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." The children didn't know it was from Galatians. They just nodded, as if she'd spoken a truth they could feel in their bones. Caleb sometimes watched from the doorway, leaning against the frame with a cup of coffee. In those moments, he could almost believe the past was finished with them. Work followed the seasons. Winter meant chopping wood until the axe handle was warm in his hands, tending the fire when the wind rattled the shutters. Spring brought fence repairs and new calves. Summer was haying, autumn was hunting. Caleb kept one rifle on a wall peg, but the Colt stayed in a box under the bed, taken out only for cleaning. He told himself that part of his life was done. But the world had a way of pressing in. Telegraph messages carried news from far away, robberies in Colorado, prison escapes in Wyoming. Most days, Caleb barely listened when Dr. Abigail or Collins mentioned such things. Then, one evening in late September, Red Hawk came by with a bundle of smoked venison and a look in his eyes that was not about meat. "There is talk in Deadwood," he said slowly. "A man asking questions about a bounty hunter with a Cherokee wife. He calls himself Rafe Torrin." Aya paused in the doorway, hands still from her sewing. Caleb felt the air shift, like the drop before a storm. By the first snow of late 1880, Aya's shape was changing. She moved slower now, a hand resting instinctively against the swell of her belly. Abigail rode out every fortnight, checking the baby's heartbeat, measuring Aya's health with brisk efficiency. "She's strong," the doctor would say, adjusting her spectacles. "And so is the child. Keep her warm, keep her fed, and keep her spirits up." The neighbors took that as a shared duty. Hollister's oldest boy stacked wood until the pile stood taller than Caleb. Widow May left jars of preserved peaches on the porch without knocking. Red Hawk and Nama brought bundles of winter herbs. It felt, for a while, like they were building a life too solid to be shaken. But the cracks came anyway. It started with the look on Red Hawk's face one evening when he stopped by for coffee. He set his cup down slowly. "I heard the name again in Deadwood, Torrin, asking questions." Caleb's fingers tightened around the mug. Aya's eyes met his across the table, steady and unflinching. They didn't need to ask which Torrin. 2 days later, Deputy Collins confirmed it. "He's in town with 3, maybe 4 men, staying low, but folks know trouble when they see it. Says he's looking for a bounty man. No prizes for guessing." That night, after the lamps were out and the fire settled into coals, they sat on the porch. The air was cold enough to cloud their breath. Caleb's arm wrapped around Aya, her hand resting over his heart. "We could leave," she said quietly. "Head south before the snow locks the passes. Torrin wouldn't follow that far." Caleb shook his head. "And spend the rest of our lives running? Looking over our shoulders, wondering if he's behind the next bend?" He looked at her belly. "What kind of life is that for our child?"
She didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the bare cottonwoods, sounding almost like distant voices. Then Aya took his hand and pressed it against her belly, where the baby shifted beneath. "If you go to him, you might not come back." "If I don't," Caleb said, "he'll come here, and we both know what he's capable of." Her grip tightened. "Then promise me something. If you ride out, you ride back, no matter what." Caleb wanted to promise in a way that made it true. He wanted to believe sheer will could bend fate.
Instead, he said the only thing he could. "I'll do everything in my power to come back to you." Aya's voice was barely above a whisper, but the words carried like a bell in the still night. "Be strong and courageous, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." She had learned it in mission school, but tonight it was as much a plea as a blessing. The next morning, Caleb spoke to Rev Whitcomb about keeping an eye on Aya. Hollister offered to bring his rifle and sleep in the barn if needed. Dr. Abigail promised to ride out twice a week until Caleb returned. But as he cleaned his Colt on the kitchen table, Caleb knew there was no guarantee. Torrin had already stolen too much from them. If he wanted peace for Aya, for their child, there was only one path left, and it led straight into the heart of danger. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The snow along the Deadwood road had thawed just enough to turn the ruts into brown slush. Caleb rode with his collar up, hat brim low, watching the hills for movement. 2 miles out, the first crack split the morning. Sharp, flat, too close.
The gelding jolted under him. Pain punched into his left shoulder. Another burning line scored his thigh. Before he could pull the Colt, more shots peppered the dirt in front of his horse. "Easy, bounty man," came Torrin's voice from the pines. 3 riders eased into the open, rifle steady. Another man stepped from behind a snowbank, rope already coiled in his hands. Caleb's mind mapped the draw, the distance, the odds, then filed it away. Outnumbered, outgunned, no way through. They took his gun belt first, then the knife from his boot. The rope bit deep into his wrists. Torrin walked close enough for Caleb to see the pale scar running along his jaw. "You've been busy," Torrin said, voice carrying that almost friendly drawl. "Married now, I hear, up on that ridge. Nice little cabin. Shame if I paid a visit before you get back." Caleb kept his face still. He knew the rules. Show nothing, give nothing. The cold in his shoulder was turning to a deep, slow throb. They marched him into town like a prize. Sheriff Bradley stood in the doorway of the jail, jaw tight, eyes flicking from Torrin to Caleb. "Found him skulking near the road," Torrin said, handing over a folded paper.
"Judge Morrison will want him kept until morning. Charges already filed." Bradley read, lips tightening. Inside. The cell door clanged shut behind Caleb. The air was damp, smelling of rust and old tobacco. Chains hung from a bolt in the wall. Torrin made a show of locking one around Caleb's ankle. "Get some rest," Torrin said, the smile not reaching his eyes. "We'll talk again come sun up." The door closed. Footsteps receded. Caleb leaned back against the wall, chains cold through his trousers. Somewhere in the dark, water dripped slow and steady. He let his eyes close for a moment, not in surrender, but to steady the compass inside him. There was no way back to the ridge without going through Torrin now. That road, he knew, had no forks left. The jail was quiet by midnight. Outside, a late wind rattled the loose signboard over the sheriff's office, making it groan in the darkness. Caleb sat on the cot, listening for the patterns of footsteps.
When they faded toward the far end of the boardwalk, a new sound replaced them, a soft scrape like fabric against wood. Aya stepped from the shadow at the barred window, hood pulled low. A dusting of frost clung to her shawl.
"You're not supposed to be here," Caleb said, voice low. "That's why I came," she answered, pulling a small bundle from under her cloak. She slid it through the gap beneath the bars, folded papers, tightly bound with twine. Names, dates, bank routes, everything Torrin told the Miles City men when he thought no one was listening. I wrote it all down and memorized it. Caleb turned the bundle over in his hands. The weight was nothing, but the value could tip a court. "You can take this to Fort Keogh," she said, "Marshal's jurisdiction. With this, Torrin hangs himself without you firing a shot." He met her gaze. "And how do I get there with chains on my leg?" Her eyes held steady. "There's a horse in the alley, saddled. Isaiah will cut the stockyard ropes at the back. The stampede will pull the deputies forward. Collins," she hesitated, "he won't see the window open." It was a clean plan, dangerous because it was simple. He slid his fingers through the bars, and she took his hand. Her grip was warm despite the frost. "If you go," she whispered, "you have to make it. For me."
For the child. In the cold space between them, her breath carried the words, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." It wasn't a sermon, it was a thread pulled tight between their hearts. Bootsteps echoed somewhere inside the building. Aya let go, pulling her hood up again. "1 hour," she said. "When you hear the mules, move." She was gone into the night before he could speak again. The cell felt smaller after her absence, the damp walls pressing in. Caleb tucked the papers under the thin mattress, his mind already tracing the route north to Fort Keogh. There was no second chance. At the next bell, he'd either be free and hunted or never see the ridge again. The bell in the Deadwood church struck 12, the sound carrying thin and sharp through the winter air. Caleb sat on the cot, every muscle coiled. Somewhere beyond the walls came the first sign, hooves clattering fast and uneven. Then the chorus broke loose. Mules screamed and kicked, the pounding of hooves mixing with the splinter of fence rails giving way. The stockyard was erupting.
From the front of the jail, May Cartwright's voice rose clear and scolding. "Sheriff Bradley, you'll take this soup before it freezes, and don't argue with me." The rattle of her pot lid drowned the shuffle of deputies moving toward her. Chains still on his ankle, Caleb crouched near the rear window. The faint creak of metal told him the latch had been turned. Collins appeared in the dim light, eyes shadowed beneath his brim. "Windows open," the deputy said flatly, not looking at Caleb. "Wouldn't be wise to linger." Then he stepped back into the dark, leaving the space clear. Caleb pushed the window up, the cold night air rushing in. He swung his leg through, landing soft on the packed snow outside. The clink of the ankle chain was swallowed by the noise from the stockyard. In the alley, Isaiah Reed was already untying the last mule. "Horse is there," he said, nodding to a bay gelding saddled and ready. "Food, shells, and what she gave you are in the bag." Caleb swung into the saddle, feeling the stiffness in his shoulder flare. The gelding danced under him, ears twitching at the chaos nearby. May's voice still rang from the front, chiding someone about manners. Isaiah slapped the rump of a mule, sending it barreling past the alley mouth. Shadows moved at the far end, but no one looked his way. Caleb eased the gelding forward, then turned into the side street. The town was a scatter of lamplight and snow, each hoofbeat carrying him further from the cell and closer to the open road. He didn't look back, not at the alley, not at the jail.
Aya's bundle lay heavy in the saddlebag, the twine biting into the leather as if holding more than paper. Every stride was a stolen second, every breath a measure of the risk. By the time the mule's noise began to fade, Deadwood was just a smear of yellow behind him, and the ridge road lay somewhere ahead, waiting for a man who had no intention of stopping there yet. The first day out, Caleb pushed hard, cutting east through frozen draws where the wind carried no sound but the horse's breathing. Snow lay crusted over the grass, breaking under the gelding's hooves in sharp snaps. Every hour he checked behind, just enough to know that if Torrin's men were coming, they were holding their distance. Nights were worse. The cold crept in through every seam of his coat, and the wound in his shoulder burned under the stiff cloth. He slept in short bursts, the colt within reach, one ear tuned for anything heavier than the wind. By the second day, the creeks were glazed in ice, so thin it sang when he crossed. At the first relay station, the keeper barely looked up as Caleb swapped horses. "Storm's brewin' north," the man muttered. Caleb filed that away. Bad weather could cover his trail, but it could also lock him in. The third night, frost rimmed the gelding's mane. Caleb found himself tracing routes in the dark, weighing miles against the possibility of ambush. Aya's bundle stayed in the saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp. Every so often he would rest his hand there, as if confirming it was still real. On the fourth afternoon, the low shape of Fort Keogh broke the horizon, blocky against the pale sky, smoke rising from its chimneys. He rode straight through the gate, stiff from cold, and slid from the saddle only when a uniformed sergeant stepped forward. "Business?" the man asked. "Evidence," Caleb said, pulling the bundle from the bag. "Names, dates, routes."
Enough to hang a man named Rafe Torrin. Within an hour, he was sitting in a cramped office across from a U.S. Marshal. The man's eyes moved over the pages, then up to Caleb's face. "You're not law," the Marshal said. "No," Caleb agreed, "but I can find him, and I can bring him in alive." There was a long pause. Then the Marshal leaned back. "You work as a civilian scout. Our rules, our jurisdiction. Torrin answers to the law, not you. Understood?" Caleb nodded. Understood. For the first time since leaving the ridge, the weight on his shoulders shifted, not gone, but shared. Torrin was no longer just his problem. He belonged to the law now, and the hunt had changed. The Badlands were a country of stone and silence, where the wind carved its own roads, and nothing moved without leaving a mark. Caleb rode with 2 deputies and a young marshal named Dorsey, following a trail of hoofprints that cut through the shale. Torrin was close. They could feel it in the way the air seemed to hold its breath. By mid-afternoon, the trail funneled into a box canyon, the walls rising in jagged tiers. Caleb reined in. "He's waiting in there," he said. Dorsey's jaw tightened. "Then we go in together." They moved slow, the echo of their horses bouncing off the stone. Dust swirled near the canyon's far end, too much for just the wind. The first shot came from the left wall. A deputy pitched sideways, blood seeping through his coat. Caleb was off his horse before it hit the ground, dragging the man behind a boulder. "Stay with him," he barked, pressing a hand to the wound. Gunfire cracked from both sides, the sound trapped and magnified by the rock. Caleb picked his shots, each round deliberate, keeping Torrin's men pinned. When a gap opened, he slipped along the canyon floor, closing the distance. Torrin stepped into view at the far end, rifle raised, a grin pulling at his mouth. "Shoulda stayed home, bounty man." Caleb didn't answer. He aimed low, the Colt bucking in his grip. Torrin staggered, the shot catching his leg, and his rifle clattered to the ground. He tried for a hidden pistol, but Dorsey's shout rang out, "Drop it!" For a heartbeat, Torrin hesitated. Then he lunged, and Caleb fired again, the round shattering the rock beside Torrin's hand. The outlaw froze, eyes darting between the gun and the deputies closing in.
It ended with iron cuffs and a trail of dust behind them. Back at Fort Keogh, affidavits were signed, warrants satisfied. The Deadwood charges against Caleb, filed on Torrin's word, were vacated in neat handwriting. Self-defense, the clerk wrote. Caleb looked at the papers, at the official seal pressed deep into the page. It wasn't joy he felt, not exactly. More like the weight shifting again, one stone at a time, toward something that might one day be peace. By April 1881, the snow had gone thin on the prairie, retreating into the shadows of gullies and fence lines. Caleb stood outside the telegraph office at Fort Keogh, the paper folded in his coat pocket. The letter was short, 3 lines from the territorial court in Deadwood confirming the dismissal of all charges. No more warrants, no more waiting for a knock at the door in the middle of the night. He should have felt free. Instead, as he saddled the bay for the ride home, a different weight settled in. The memory of every mile between him and the ridge, every face that had stood between Aya and danger. The ride south was slower this time. He stopped in small towns, trading news for coffee, letting the horse graze longer in the mornings. At night, he camped under skies that were almost warm, the stars sharp against the dark. He found himself listening for the sounds of the cabin. Aya's soft steps on the porch, the kettle lid rattling just before a boil. 4 days in, he crossed the Little Missouri, where the ice had broken into floating sheets. The current tugged at the horse's legs, cold seeping into Caleb's boots. On the far bank, he paused to wring the water from his coat sleeves and looked back once. North, toward the fort, toward the place where Torrin's trail had ended. The last leg wound through pine stands, the air carrying the faint resin smell of sap waking after winter. As the ridge came into view, he could see the faint thread of smoke from the cabin chimney. It pulled something tight in his chest. He thought of the words Aya had spoken through the bars in Deadwood. Psalm 23:4, a breath in the dark. They had carried him through more than the ride. They had carried him through the choice to keep going when turning back might have been easier. By the time the sun slid behind the western hills, the cabin door was only a few yards ahead. Caleb slowed the bay to a walk. He wasn't sure if Aya would be on the porch or if she'd be resting, but he knew she was there. And for the first time in months, the road behind him felt closed, not with chains, but with the quiet finality of a chapter turned. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. The ridge looked much the same as the day he had left, pines holding their dark green against the April sky, the cabin's roof patched in places where winter storms had tested it. Smoke rose from the stovepipe, thin but steady, curling into the cool air. Caleb slowed his horse at the gate, the leather creak of the saddle loud in the hush. It wasn't the cabin that stopped him. It was the small wooden cross planted in the garden bed just beyond the porch. The letters, carved by a careful hand, read, "Grace Hart, taken too soon." Aya came to the doorway, a shawl drawn close around her. Her eyes told him the rest. 2 weeks after he had ridden from Deadwood under the shadow of Torrin's threats, a blizzard had swept through. Abigail had been snowed in on the far side of the pass. The neighbors tried, but the roads vanished under drifts as high as the fence rails. Aya labored alone, the storm hammering the roof, until the cries stilled too soon. Caleb stepped down from the horse without a word. He crossed the yard, the sound of his boots on the thawing ground uneven. When he reached her, he simply set his hand over hers where she clutched the shawl. The space between them held more than words could. 3 days later, the community gathered. Reverend Whitcomb stood in the garden, the wind tugging at the pages of his small Bible. His prayer was brief, speaking of rest and of a shepherd who gathered his own.
Nama, the Lakota elder, stepped forward with a braid of sweetgrass and a scattering of corn kernels, symbols of blessing for the journey onward. Caleb set the family Bible on the ground beside the cross, its leather worn by generations, closing the circle between two traditions without a single seam showing. The sheriff from Miles City had ridden up with the others, bringing quiet news. Torrin's trial had ended quickly. Witnesses had spoken, papers had been signed, the sentence was final. Justice, though late, had come without spectacle. Caleb listened, nodded once, and let the matter fall behind him. That night, the cabin was lit only by the fire. Caleb went to the chest at the foot of the bed, lifted the lid, and took out the Colt. He checked it once, then placed it inside a small wooden box. The key he hung on a nail driven high in the wall, high enough that no child's hand could reach. Outside, the frost was settling into the ground again, but in the garden, beneath the small cross, the earth had been turned. Aya had planted early peas there, trusting the warmth would come. The seasons turned with quiet certainty. That first summer, Caleb took 2 short bounty rides, enough to settle the last of the debts and lay in supplies for the year. When autumn came, he oiled the Colt, wrapped it in cloth, and placed it back in the wooden box. This time, he locked the lid and slid the key deep into a drawer. The nail on the wall remained empty. Life found a slower rhythm. Aya's strength returned, though the grief never fully left her eyes. Winter was gentler that year, the snow falling soft instead of sharp. By early spring, Abigail began making regular visits to the cabin, her bag swinging from the crook of her arm and a quiet smile on her face. On a warm afternoon in August, Aya gave birth to a son. They named him Jacob Elias Hart. His first cry filled the cabin, bouncing off the log walls and into the waiting arms of a father who had thought he might never hear such a sound. With a baby in the cradle, laughter found its way back into the rooms. Aya reopened her little school on the porch, chalkboard propped against the wall, benches built from spare pine planks Caleb had shaped himself. Children came from the scattered homesteads, Lakota, Irish, Swedish, bringing the clatter of boots and the smell of the prairie on their clothes. In the quiet after lessons, Aya would rock Jacob while Caleb mended harness straps or set fence posts. Years widened around them. Jacob grew into long legs and quick hands, learning the ways of his mother's garden, the names of plants in both English and Lakota, and the horse sense of his father, how to ride with a loose rein, how to listen for the shift in the wind. The community knew their story, but it was told less like a legend and more like a memory, a reminder that the valley could be hard and still hold kindness. Some spoke of the night Widow May blocked a saloon door with nothing but her soup pot. Others remembered the quiet moment Nama laid sweetgrass in the snow. One autumn, Caleb planted a young apple tree near the garden. For shade, he told Jacob, but Aya knew better. It was for the long years ahead, for something that would outlast them. By the time Caleb reached 67, the nail on the wall was still bare. Aya followed him a decade later, leaving the cabin to Jacob and his growing family. In the churchyard and in the garden where the peas had first broken ground after that hard spring, their names were written into the soil. On a small stone at the edge of the ridge, someone, maybe Jacob, maybe one of the neighbors, had carved the words Caleb had lived by in the years after Deadwood. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good.
Romans 12:21. Maybe this tale feels familiar because it brushes against the worn places of your own life. The porch light left burning, the hymn you still hum without meaning to, the way a single act of kindness can steady a shaking day. If you've ever buried a name in a garden, waited at a window for someone you love, or learned to keep going with a verse whispered under your breath, then you already know the country this story walks through. The West was never only gun smoke and gold. It was kitchens warm with steam,
neighbors who showed up with soup, and quiet vows kept when no one was watching. That's the heart of true Wild West stories. Ordinary courage, ordinary mercy, lived one small choice at a time. If this chapter stirred something in you, I'd love to hear it. Tell us which moment rang true, or share a memory of the people who raised you strong and gentle. Pass this story to a friend who could use a little hope tonight. And if you'd like more true Wild West stories told with care for faith, family, and the land, follow along, leave a comment, and join our little circle. Your voice keeps the fire going.